Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. Here's the bottom line. It is now mid-January. I don't want to say we're quite through football yet because football never really ends. There's always something to talk about in football, but we are starting to get to the heart of college basketball season. The SEC continues to take center stage night after night after night. We get big games, great matchups. It delivers every single time we have an SEC game on the schedule. Saturday will be no exception because we have yet another top 10 matchup at Rupp Arena. A few weeks ago, it was Florida at Kentucky. We had a top 15 matchup just the other day, Texas A&M at Kentucky. Well, Saturday, yet another top 10 matchup. Every night we have a game that could be like a future Final Four matchup. This is no exception. Alabama at Kentucky, both top 10 teams. I'm recording on Thursday night here, so we don't quite yet know what the point spread is. I would guess Kentucky will be like a 1.5, 2-point favorite. But I bring it up because this one's going to be awesome. And I'd be remiss if we did not preview this game in the lead up to Saturday afternoon at Rupp Arena. Thankfully, by the way, not the 11 a.m. tip-off we had a few weeks ago, but at least we get the noon Eastern tip-off at Rupp Arena. Listen, fascinating matchup. We've talked a ton about Kentucky, so let's get into Alabama. And it's funny, right? This speaks to the depth and the talent in the SEC, where a week ago you had guys like me. Listen, I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to run from it. I was calling Alabama the most underappreciated, underrated team in all of the sport. Basically, everybody's focused on Auburn and Tennessee and Kentucky's great story and Iowa State and all these teams outside of Alabama. Then all of a sudden, Alabama looks unbeatable. They beat Texas A&M at Texas A&M. Then they go home. Then they play Ole Miss. And Ole Miss kind of smacked them around a little bit. Now, to me, that's more of a byproduct of just how deep and talented this league is, how many great coaches there are. But I will say we can't deny that a little bit of concern has emerged from Alabama because I do think there are a couple trends that I think Ole Miss kind of accentuated that you have to be worried about if you're a Tide fan. Now, there's plenty of positive. We're going to get to that in a minute, but we got to talk a little bit about the concerns as well. Biggest concern in that Ole Miss game. Now, to be clear, Ole Miss, and this is not an Ole Miss segment, but they are great defensively. They force a ton of turnovers. They are one of the best teams in America at forcing turnovers. And I know that like turnover margin is more of a football stat, but I will say in basketball, if you take care of the ball and you can force the other team into a lot of turnovers, you're going to be in pretty good shape. Ole Miss does that really well, and I thought it was highlighted for Alabama on Tuesday night at Coleman Coliseum. Alabama finishes with 21 turnovers in that game. The amazing stat that others have brought up, but I think it's worth noting here. Alabama had more turnovers, 21, than made field goals against Ole Miss. That sounds like a made-up, impossible stat. No, that actually happened as Alabama finishes with 20 made field goals, 21 turnovers, and this is now sort of a continuing trend for Alabama. 268th nationally entering the weekend in terms of total turnovers per game. Now, I know they play a little bit faster than most teams, but they're averaging about 13 and a half turnovers per game. That's not going to get it done. What's kind of wild to me about that stat, Alabama basically has three guys that are de facto point guards in their lineup that all play a lot. Aiden Holloway, Mark Sears, and of course, on top of that, LeBaron Philon, the star freshman. So you'd think they take care of the basketball a little bit better. And then also the other concern that I think is worth noting, we think of Alabama, we think of Nate Oates as this great three-point shooting team in this great three-point shooting system under Coach Oates. They're not shooting the three ball all that well. It's kind of worth noting they weren't a great three-point shooting team for most of last year either. They got hot during the NCAA tournament, but this year, they're shooting 32% through the early part of the season. Mark Sears is carrying the way about 36%, but Latrell Wrightsell was their best three-point shooter. He's out for the season. Chris Youngblood, I think, will get there. He's been a great three-point shooter throughout his career, but he's coming back from injury. Right now, they are not a great three-point shooting team. Same time, listen, I've talked a lot of negative with Alabama. Let's get to some of the positives here. Listen, But I mean, listen, I could sit here and tear down Alabama after a loss all day, but let's not forget, even after the loss, 14-3, even after the loss, like Kentucky, have already beaten 5 teams that were ranked when Alabama played them. Now, some of them are no longer ranked, but listen, they beat Houston, legitimate top 10 team. They beat Illinois, which in my opinion, as you've heard me say on this show, I think they're a top 10 to 12 team in college basketball right now. I think they're the best team in the Big Ten. Whether they win the Big Ten or not is irrelevant. They've won at A&M. They took care of business against Oklahoma. So I can criticize Alabama while also saying the criticisms are still to the fact that this is still a really, 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 really good basketball team. And let's highlight some of the things they do well. First off, Mark Sears is starting to play like an All-American, starting to play like the preseason SEC Player of the Year. Now, I know he wasn't great against Ole Miss on Tuesday night, but in the previous 4 games had scored 20-plus points. Alabama rebounds the ball exceptionally well. I've said this a few times. I think when you talk about teams, they call them airport teams, right? When you see a team walk through an airport, you're like, oh my goodness, who the heck is that? They must be an NBA team. I think Alabama passes the test with flying colors. They might be the most impressive looking airport team in college basketball. Big across the front line, Cliff Omoyori, Grant Nelson, Darian Reed, who is hurt. I assume he's not going to play this game. He was in a boot on Tuesday night. Aiden Sherrill, you go on and on down list. Jaron Stevenson, by the way, 6'10" guy that can shoot threes. So I just bring it up because Alabama, for all the criticism early, they are a very talented team. They're a big team. They rebound the ball exceptionally well. And I'll say this is that, it's the oldest cliche because Alabama hands out the hard hat award for like the toughest playing player on the roster every single game. I solely bring it up to say, you better bring your hard hat against Alabama because they are going to crash the boards, and they are going to crash the boards hard. With that said, let's talk a little bit about Kentucky. Listen, I've talked so much Kentucky over the past month or so. I don't know that you need me to break down every single thing about them. There's a lot of positives. There's some negatives, like there's negatives for every team in college basketball. But the positives are clearly starting to outweigh the negatives. They're on a 2-game win streak, which doesn't sound like much, but in the SEC, that's like an 8-game win streak in other leagues. Both wins over top 15 teams. They beat Mississippi State on the road. They take care of Texas A&M at home. And I thought that Texas A&M game really shined a lot of positives on this team going into this game and really the rest of the season. The first one, and we talked about it on the pod on Wednesday morning. Here's the thing, is that this was the first really big win they had where it wasn't just a back and forth shootout. Texas A&M, we talked about it. Jimmy Dykes, he said it time and time again during that game. Texas A&M wants to drag you in the mud. Texas A&M wants you to make them play your game. And so you look at that win. It is impressive because this wasn't the 94-92 victory that we've seen in other games. Gonzaga was high scoring. Mississippi State was high scoring. Florida was in the hundreds. This was a game where Texas A&M tried to bully Kentucky, where a Kentucky team that even Kentucky fans will say, are we tough enough? Well, they passed that test with flying colors because they certainly looked tough enough to me against Texas A&M in a game where they out-rebounded Texas A&M, in a game where they had more paint points than Texas A&M, in a game where they matched the physicality and toughness that they needed to beat one of the tougher, more experienced teams in college basketball. Amari Williams, I know I've been critical of him, but 8 points, 12 boards in that game. And then I think outside of the toughness conversation, the big conversation was, is Jackson Robinson finally emerging as that star that Kentucky desperately needs? We've talked about it over the last 3, 4, 5 weeks. Is there a consistent guy that can get you consistent stats? And with due respect to Otega Oweh might be that guy, but even Otega Oweh has moments where he might score a lot of points, but he's inconsistent, doesn't shoot the ball at a high clip. Well, guess what? Jackson Robinson, 27 points against Mississippi State, 22 more against his former team in Texas A&M, 5 of 13 from behind the three-point arc. Is he emerging into that 18 to 20 a game guy that Kentucky needs? Because if so, that is mortifying for the rest of college basketball. With that said, we're 10 minutes into this video. Let's go ahead and get you an official pick in this game. Listen, I'll say it. I don't know if it's popular, if it's unpopular. I'm going to take Kentucky to win. to win this game. I'll say in like the neighborhood of like 87, 81. A couple things stand out to me. Well, first of all, what this game is going to come down to, what I truly believe, second chance points for both of these teams. Alabama's been a great offensive rebounding team. I think Kentucky, when they're kind of manhood, when that kind of stuff is questioned, they seem to always step up to the challenge. It was questioned, after the Ohio State game. They were great against Florida. It was questioned after the Georgia game. They were great against Mississippi State. It was questioned in the Texas A&M game, even off of a loss. If it gets down again into the mud, into the muck, if it's physical, if it's low scoring, can you handle it? Well, Kentucky's been able to handle it. Well, I promise you, Mark Pope behind the scenes, I guarantee that he has been reiterating to these guys, hey, look, if you think you won, if you think one game against a great opponent is reason for celebration and reason to have a ticker tape parade in Lexington, I'm sorry, but that ain't the case. You better bring your hard hat, because if not, Alabama's going to beat you on the boards. So it's not about one team dominating the boards, but it's one team. What this game's about is you can't get dominated on the other side. Both teams have big guys. Both teams have athleticism. Both teams have skill. It comes down to just, you can't get beat up on the boards. I don't think either team will. There's too many veterans, too much experience. Beyond that, I'll say this. Kentucky has at times been inconsistent, but they are shooting the ball better on the season overall as a team than Alabama. And I think with Alabama, again, we default to Nate Oates this, Nate Oates that. Nate Oates is, listen, I love Nate Oates. I said last offseason, that's the guy that I would have gone after if I was Kentucky's AD, Mitch Barnhart, when we were replacing the former head coach. So it's not that I don't like Nate Oates, but that's independent of the fact that this particular roster does not shoot the three ball well, at least not yet, at least not at this moment in time in terms of this team and all that good stuff. So I could go on and on and on and on and on. I could go on and on and on. But to me, I think it comes down to rebounding. I think both teams are so big and so tough. I don't think either team is going to get bullied. And then who makes more three-pointers? I think Kentucky does just enough. Like I said, give me an 87-81 win. I will take Kentucky to win. I will take Kentucky to cover. That is my official best bet and pick in this game.